Order. Order. Questions to the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. Colleen Fletcher.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Secretary James Brokenshire.
Mr. Speaker, this government believes that one person without a home is one too many. This is why we have committed £1.2 billion to tackle homelessness and implemented the Homelessness Reduction Act in April. We're also producing a cross-government strategy to tackle rough sleeping, which is due to be published next month.
Colleen Fletcher.
In December 2010, there were 22 homeless households in temporary accommodation in Coventry. In December last year, there was a massive 278 homeless households in the city. 210 of these were families with children, with a total of 505 children between them. Why does the Minister think the number of homeless children has risen so significantly under this government?
Well, I hope she will recognise the work that this government has done and is doing with the commitment of £9 billion to affordable housing. And in part, this is about supply, about ensuring that we have the right number of homes, and why it is this government that is taking action, that is investing, that is actually seeking to respond to those challenges of homelessness and indeed rough sleeping. And I hope that she would indeed welcome the initiative with Housing First in the West Midlands to tackle rough sleeping in particular and ensure that we're really responding to this important issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recent report by Crisis sets out a comprehensive and practical plan for ending homelessness. Could I encourage the Secretary of State, along with the excellent plans he's already announced, to work with Crisis so that we can actually tackle both homelessness but also its underlying causes?
Mr. Speaker, I do congratulate Crisis on their work as they mark their 50th anniversary and indeed spoke at their recent conference. I indicated then that I will work with them on furthering the initiatives around rough sleeping, which I've spoken about, and also note what they have said about homelessness, and indeed will continue to work with them and others.
Mr. Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many trends from the 1990s I would like to bring back to this country. Decent indie music, for example. But rough sleeping is not one of them. I pay tribute to the Forest Emergency Night Shelter in Waltham Forest that helped 109 people in just one borough this winter. But the truth is, Secretary of State, this problem continues, and tonight approximately 40 people will sleep rough in a graveyard in Walthamstow. Can I invite the Secretary of State to come with me to meet those people, to understand how we can finally, frankly, get a grip of this and get a roof over their heads?
The Honourable Lady speaks rightly, very passionately about this issue of rough sleeping, something that I too feel very strongly about, which was why my first visit as Secretary of State was to Birmingham, to a homelessness charity that was actively supporting people who are rough sleeping. And it is why this government is committed to eradicating rough sleeping, why we in recent weeks have committed a further £30 million to those areas most affected. This is a very serious issue. She is right to be passionate about it, as am I.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the news last week of 279,000 extra coming to Torbay to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. Would he reassure me that the lessons from the previous pilot carried out with the Torbay End Street homelessness campaign will be incorporated into the strategy he's bringing out next month?
Well, can I commend my honourable friend for the work that I know and his charities and all the organisations that are working locally in Torbay around this significant issue, and obviously the additional funding that has been identified. Part of this is, yes, in ensuring that this money is used effectively, that we do learn from previous lessons, and indeed that local authorities are held accountable for the monies that have been applied.
Morris.
Number 2, sir.
Mr. Speaker, as of the 22nd of May, remediation has started on 107 buildings over 18 metres in the social sector identified with combinations of aluminium composite material cladding and insulation which failed fire performance tests. Work has been completed on 10 buildings.
And Morris.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for that update, but could he give a timescale for when the other tower blocks in the both private and in the public sector, what is the timescale for the removal of these dangerous panels?
Well, I recognise the very clear desire and intent to see that these buildings are made safe and the remediation is completed at the earliest possible opportunity. I would say to the honourable gentleman that the works are complex and detailed and will take time. We are continuing to monitor and continuing to work with local authorities in ensuring that progress is made, recognising the real public safety issues that he underlines.
Clive Betts.
Speaker, the Secretary of State is rightly consulting on banning all material that is not of limited combustibility from high-rise buildings, and the Select Committee hopes that he will bring in such a ban after the consultation. Can I ask him, if he concludes that it is right to ban such material from all new buildings, does he accept it will be completely untenable to leave the same material on existing buildings? And in such case, does he accept the government will have a responsibility to financially compensate the building owners affected?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Chair of the Select Committee will know the £400 million which we have committed to support the public sector in remediation costs and therefore to see that that work is undertaken well. Obviously, we will reflect carefully on the consultation that will be launched and therefore look at its application. But I think the key message is that we need to make progress, we need to get on with this so that buildings that have been identified in need of remediation are dealt with.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the SNP, I pay tribute to all of the Grenfell survivors and people in that area whose dignified celebrations we all witnessed last week. There remains an issue about people in high-rise buildings that are in the private sector. Can he tell me what response he has made to Kevin Stewart, MSP, Scotland's Housing Minister, on his calls to exempt private buildings from VAT on materials to refurbish those buildings?
Yeah.
Well, obviously that is a matter for the Treasury, but what I would say to her is that there is a need to make progress. I look forward to continuing discussions with the Scottish Government and equally, as she has said, pay tribute to the incredible community at Grenfell for, I think, the extraordinary way in which they underline that strength that they have together and how that has brought the country together as well, and how we must very firmly continue to have that in mind.
I thank him for that answer, and he will have seen, as we all have, the pictures from Glasgow over the weekend, where the Glasgow School of Art also had a devastating fire. Unfortunately, there was no loss of life, although local residents are still waiting to get back into their homes. Would he agree that there's perhaps more need to look at VAT exemptions also for sprinkler systems in buildings, so that more public buildings can be encouraged to have those installed, not least in this building that we're in today, because it also is built in a similar way to the Glasgow School of Art and could be as dangerous?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we were all horrified to see the terrible fire at the Glasgow School of Art and just what that iconic building has meant to so many people over the years. She highlights the issue of sprinklers. Can I be clear on that? For existing buildings, it is for the building owner to decide whether to retrospectively fit sprinklers as part of a fire safety strategy. Obviously, it is for those building owners to make those determinations, but clearly it can be an effective safety measure as part of an overarching strategy.
Mr. Speaker, you and I and other members of the House were privileged to be part of the Grenfell Silent Walk with survivors and supporters last Thursday. They, like this House, want ministers to take every action necessary to prevent such a fire ever happening again. And yet, since Grenfell, 1,319 suspect cladding samples sent to the government's testing centre have been refused testing, as ministers say they'll only test the aluminium composite material the minister spoke of earlier. Why?
Well, I will happily look into what the Right Honourable Gentleman has said. From the BRE focus has obviously been on the ACM material that has been at the forefront of concerns to ensure that both in the public sector and the private sector that can be tested, to ensure that where there has been cladding that does not meet the necessary standards, that is dealt with and that the actual remediation steps can take place. But I will certainly look in greater detail at the point that he has made.
Mr. Speaker, that simply isn't good enough from the Secretary of State. The BRE does what ministers tell them to do. And we know that other cladding and insulation materials have been found unsafe. We know the Hackett review has confirmed that the whole building regulation system from end to end is, she says, not fit for purpose. So since Grenfell, ministers have been too slow to take responsibility, too slow to act, and this Conservative dogma of hands-off is delaying the government action necessary to deal with this national disaster. So will the Secretary of State give local authorities powers to demand testing and recladding is actually done? Will he release the details he holds on tower block owners who won't do this work? And will he set a deadline, like my honourable friend says, for all landlords to make their buildings safe, or make clear government will step in and then make them?
Well, I firmly recognise the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman has made as to the urgency of this, which is why we have committed an additional £1 million to local authorities to identify those sites. Indeed, in my time as Secretary of State, the additional commitment of the £400 million to the social sector to ensure that we get on with this remediation. And it is that action, it is that focus that I am intent on pursuing, to see that that sense of safety, assurance is given. Why, with Judith Hackett's report, that I have said about the banning of combustible cladding and the consultation to be pursued to bring that into effect. He should be in no doubt, the House should be in no doubt, as the priority this government gives, and we will continue to pursue that approach.
These are extremely important matters, but can I just very gently say to colleagues on back and front benches alike, we must speed up. Ruth Smith. That's the way to
Mr. Speaker, since 2010, we have delivered over 357,000 new affordable homes, including 128,000 for social rent. We're investing over £9 billion in the Affordable Homes programme to support the delivery of new affordable homes.
Smith.
Thank you very much. But the Minister failed to point out that in the last 6 months only 199 houses were built. Given the Minister's failure to actually build new housing, maybe instead we can look at actions to deal with the 7,235 privately owned empty houses in Stoke-on-Trent.
I say to the honourable lady that more affordable homes have been delivered in the last 7 years than in the last 7 years of the last Labour government. And so it is, I think, a bit rich to press us when you look at the housing starts overall at 207, the completed new homes that have been delivered with 217,000 in the last year. And, it is the £9 billion as well on affordable homes that this government is committed to. And I think she should reflect on that in terms of our own priority here.
£2 billion into the Affordable Homes programme. How many more homes for social rent should this provide by the end of this Parliament?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have identified additional funding for affordable homes and social rent. I will be making a further announcement in relation to what this means outside of London, and therefore it is something that I will be returning to the House to update, recognising the importance of this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like briefly to thank you and members of all parties who supported the Grenfell community by attending the memorial services, the silent walk, speaking in the House and by wearing the Green Heart. So I ask the Secretary of State if you'll politely insist that all members who've shown support by wearing the Green Heart should support my request for a backbench debate so we can discuss all these issues in one place to discuss the Grenfell response. We have a list of Green Heart wearers and we'll be writing to you today. Please show us you care and support my debate.
Well, I commend the honourable lady for the work that she has done locally and just that strength of her community in the face of this appalling tragedy. I can't speak around the awarding of backbench business debates. If she is seeking one, I'm sure that will be considered carefully. But we have updated the House regularly in relation to the response around Grenfell, and I can say to her that we will continue to do so.
But I would advise the honourable lady, the Secretary of State is quite right in disavowing responsibility for the Backbench Business Committee, is that she could usefully sidle up to and have a word with the honourable gentleman, the member for Gateshead, who chairs the Backbench Business Committee. He's not in his place at the moment, but I dare say he will be in due course, and I'm sure she will find that a most useful conversation. Andrew Bridget.
Would my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the fact that North West Leicestershire District Council are building the first new council houses in my constituency in the last 30 years?
I absolutely do, and I commend the work that his council is doing. Indeed, with the housing revenue account, we are looking at how we can strengthen that further and see a new generation of council house builds, and I commend his local authority for getting on with that.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has just talked of his affordable homes record. But we all know that this government's definition of affordable homes is a joke. It allows an illusion of genuinely affordable house building, which is simply not happening. Many of his own backbenchers agree, and 10 of them are meeting the Prime Minister on Wednesday to call for more genuinely affordable homes. We've seen the number of new social rented homes funded by government at its lowest ever level. Fewer than 1,000 started last year. Can the Secretary of State, therefore, match Labour's commitment in our own social housing green paper to scrap the bogus definition of affordable rent at up to 80% of market rents and to invest in genuinely affordable homes?
Well, I hope the Honourable Lady will welcome the fall in housing waiting lists under this government. So, I say to her very clearly, the steps that have been taken under this government to respond to this challenge. And I would remind her again of the £9 billion that has been committed to affordable homes. The change that will bring to so many people, and actually creating the vision of a home and making that a reality. That is the intent of this government, and that is something that we will deliver.
Tommy Shepherd.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much indeed. On the 8th of June, this department announced £1.75 million to help new refugees by funding 35 offices in 19 areas in England with some of the highest numbers of asylum seekers. They will support people granted asylum into housing, learning and work. And the department is very keen to share this learning widely, including with the devolved administrations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's consultation report, Integrated Communities, said, and I quote, that the government will work with civil society and others to increase the integration support available to those granted refugee status after arrival in the UK. Can I therefore ask what specific measures are being taken to ensure that newly recognised refugees get the same level of support as resettled refugees?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this pilot programme is drawn from the Controlling Migration Fund, and it has no remit to finance the devolved administrations as funding is devolved in this area. But these pilot programmes are now recruiting staff and getting their programmes up and running likely. The pilots will run for 2 years and are funded in the first year by my department and in the second year by the council themselves.
Stephen Hepburn.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Jake Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From 2015-16 to 1920, North East councils will have access to £11.3 billion in core spending power. The 18-19 settlement sees a 1.9% increase in the money available to North East councils.
Stephen Hepburn.
The Minister will be aware that North East councils have had a 50% cut in government grants since 2010. At the same time, the richest individuals in this country have had a £10 billion cut in tax. Does the Minister think it's right that these needless tax cuts are paid for by local government jobs, pay cuts and loss of local government services?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the subject of those who can afford it building up savings, I might point out to the honourable gentleman that it's his local authority, and I'll remind him, I'm sure he knows, that every seat except one is held by the Labour Party, that has increased their reserves by £7 million since 2010. So perhaps these redundancies and closures, he should be addressing the questions to the local Labour Party.
Thank you. The Minister knows that the slashing of funding for Newcastle City Council can be seen in the increased litter on our streets, in increased crime rates as youth services are cut, and in reduced public services generally. What will he say to my constituents who want to know why the central government cares so little for their well-being?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of whether central government cares for people in Newcastle, I suppose what I'd say to them is, surely they, like the Honourable Lady, should welcome the £600 million of new money provided for the devolution deal. The Great Exhibition of the North opening this Friday is set to boost their economy by £184 million. The budget announced £337 million for the Tyne and Wear Metro. North East LEPs have had £379 million invested in them directly, and the North East Investment Fund was just announced with £120 million. What I would say is this is a golden era of government investment in the North East, but it takes the Conservative Party to deliver it.
Get in there.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd answer questions 6 and 14 together. As part of the Department's oversight of local government, we consider the financial stability and service delivery of individual authorities, liaising with the Department of Health on adult social care. And on this basis, we have no immediate concerns on the ability of local authorities to fulfil their statutory duties.
Guinness.
Wow, I'm shocked by that response. This year's precept of 1% raises only 0.8% of our total adult social care budget in the borough of Rochdale. And with nursing home beds being converted into residential beds because of providers' difficulties in recruiting and retaining nurses, how does the Minister suggest that my local authority provides the nursing home beds that my constituents so desperately need?
Mr. Speaker, this government has increased funding for social care across the country, and rather than talking down the honourable member's constituency and her local authority, I would point out that Rochdale's performance in reducing delayed transfers of care is actually among the best in the country and deserves praise rather than talking down.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend we saw the announcement of additional funding for the NHS, but no mention of funding to resolve the funding issues in social care as part of that package. Can the Secretary of State tell us now what discussions there were with him about the future funding of social care in advance of this announcement?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the honourable member is this government wants to guarantee the security and dignity of people in old age, and the government is absolutely committed to providing a long-term, sustainable settlement on social care, which he and the House knows the Health Secretary is working on and plans to bring forward plans in due course.
Andrew Gwynn.
Mr. Speaker, 1.2 million older people in England living with unmet care needs, according to Age UK. Over 400,000 fewer people are receiving publicly funded social care than in 2010. Council spending on adult social care fell by 10% in real terms between 2010 and 2015, and a miserly £150 million in funding announced for 2018-19 in the local government finance settlement. And now we hear, Mr. Speaker, that there's no funding for social care in yesterday's NHS announcement. So with social care in crisis, putting pressure on the NHS, sending councils across England towards bankruptcy, when's this minister going to do his job and secure the resources that our councils need to give the elderly the dignity they so desperately deserve?
This government is already responding to the pressures in social care, which is why this government announced £2 billion in last year's budget for local authorities up and down the country. That represents a real terms increase every year from last year to next year in social care spending, and we are seeing it translate to action on the ground with a 40% reduction in social care delayed transfers of care just last month.
Nigel Huddleston.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Dominic Raab.
We've delivered 357,000 affordable homes since 2010, more than the last 7 years of the last Labour government, and we'll be spending £9 billion on affordable housing, including social housing, up until 2022.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister join me in thanking housing associations across the country for all the great work that they do on social housing, and in particular rooftop housing in my constituency, which has built 850 homes in the last 6 years, including substantial housing for elderly people and those with supported care needs?
Well, housing associations have played a key role in delivering over 41,000 homes through the Affordable Homes Programme last year. I certainly welcome the contribution from the housing associations in my honourable friend's constituency, and we're restless to do more through measures such as long-term rent certainty and also raising the HRA borrowing cap.
Emma Reynolds.
Speaker, does the Minister recognise that for many on low incomes, paying 80% of market rent is not affordable, it's simply unaffordable? And when will the government ditch this twisted notion of affordability and build more homes for social rent?
Well, we are lifting the HRA borrowing cap. We are providing local authorities and housing associations longer-term certainty with their rents, and we also look forward to the publication of the Social Housing Green Paper to address all these issues in the round.
I must say to the Minister that on Saturday at the Buckingham Literary Festival, I met one of the honourable gentleman's constituents, and I told the constituent that the honourable gentleman was a clever fellow. Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask my honourable friend what steps the government is doing to try and speed up the local planning process and make it more about delivering affordable housing and new homes than about local, narrow, petty, partisan politics?
Well, can I thank the Speaker for his warm, kind words, and also say to my honourable friend, through the changes that we're making to the National Planning Policy Framework, we want to streamline the process to get the homes built, and in particular with the emphasis on the housing delivery test, make sure that the homes are built for the next generation.
Daniel Zeichner.
Mr. Speaker, there's growing interest on this side of the House in funding social housing through land value uplift. I wonder if the Minister could tell us whether he has any plans to introduce a land value cap within the lifetime of this Parliament.
Well, I certainly welcome his thoughts. We've heard about ideas in relation to that on our side of the House as well. I'd be very happy to see any proposals he's got in relation to that, and we would certainly look at them very seriously.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To enable developers to build the right proportion of affordable housing, Mr. Speaker, it's essential that they have the money for infrastructure. And in that respect, I want to welcome the £7.6 million we got for the Spine Road in Staplegrove. But could the Minister comment on when results, or we might know whether another bid might be announced for £80 million, which was a joint fund between my council and Sedgemoor?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. The Homes Infrastructure Fund is absolutely vital because people rightly ask their local authorities with the ambition to build new homes, where will the roads, the schools, the clinics come? We are taking forward a whole range of bids to co-development, and the business proposals will be analysed by my department, and we'll be making some further announcements on that during the autumn.
Mr. Speaker, the Ministry's own figures show that at the end of 2014, the number of households in temporary accommodation in Bromley stood at 956. By December 2017, this figure rose to 1,501. There are simply not enough affordable homes in London. So when will the government take real action to make sure that councils like Bromley get building?
Well, I have to say to the honourable lady, we are raising the revenue cap, the HRA revenue cap, to give local authorities more of the flexibility to get the homes delivered. She might also want to have a word with the Mayor of London, because we want to see ambition from central government right the way through. She's right to mention the local councils, but also make sure City Hall is doing their bit.
Order. Mr. Adams.
This government is continuing to identify ways to ensure local authorities make full and efficient use of brownfield land, including through changes to the NPPF, supporting reuse of buildings through permitted development rights, and by requiring every authority to publish and maintain a register of brownfield land suitable for housing.
I thank my honourable friend for that answer, but could I ask what progress has been made in giving Homes England the powers and resources that they need to acquire sites that are in fragmented ownership in order to deliver regeneration for our communities?
The honourable gentleman is well known for his work in ensuring that brownfield land is prioritised for development, but this government is currently working up the details of a new £1.1 billion land assembly fund to enable Homes England to work alongside private developers to develop strategic sites, including new settlements and urban regeneration schemes. Homes England is also encouraged to use its powers of compulsory purchase where necessary to deliver community regeneration.
That's it, Mr. Speaker. Where local authorities find a shortage of brownfield sites under the new national plan proposals, how would they be exempt, and would the Secretary of State reserve the powers to call it in?
Well, I can tell you, the honourable gentleman, that the government doesn't have the ability to force local authorities to build on brownfield sites, but I'm sure we can write to the honourable gentleman to get specific details of his local authority area needs.
Mary Robinson.
Speaker, with former offices currently being converted into high-quality apartments in Cheadle-Hulme, it's clear that first-class housing can be built using existing brownfield land and through office redevelopments. Does the Minister agree with me that district centres can be revitalised with permitted developments which provide much-needed local town centre homes?
And again, the Honourable Lady is a fantastic local champion for her area, and it's very important that a local authority with government continues to identify ways to increase the take-up of these sites, especially for new homes, and ensure that suitable brownfield is prioritised for development.
Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Mr. Speaker, recent figures from the Campaign to Protect Rural England show that the amount of farmland, forests, gardens and greenfield land lost to development each year has increased by 58% over the past 4 years. So what is the government going to do to better protect our vital green spaces and redevelop our brownfield sites that are so urgently in need of regeneration?
The Honourable Lady makes a very important point, and she will no doubt be aware of the protections that are in the NPPF to ensure that green belts and greenfield sites are protected. And I encourage all honourable and right honourable members to remind their local authorities that there are protections there within that policy framework.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will know that I recently wrote to the Secretary of State to make a strong case for calling in a decision made by Labour-controlled Bradford Council to build 500 houses on the Greenbelt in Burley and Wharfdale in my constituency. Given that today's Bradford Telegraph and Argus has reported that Bradford Council are taking out of the plan 600, a site in the city centre, a brownfield site, where over 600 houses would have been built to make it used as a car park until at least 2024, will he guarantee that there can clearly not be exceptional circumstances to build 500 houses on the Greenbelt in Burley and Wharfdale?
Minister.
Well, I'm afraid that I haven't actually read the Bradford Telegraph and Argus this morning and seen that particular news. However, I shall try and get a copy by the end of today. With a specific case like that, I'm sure my honourable friend will realise I can't comment specifically. I understand my colleague, the Minister for Housing, will be writing to him in very short order.
Hi, Gamesbury.
Question number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are delivering economic growth across the Northern Powerhouse, and we're doing this by devolving more power and investing more than any government in history in our transport infrastructure. That is why, since the Northern Powerhouse was launched, we've grown the Northern economy by £20 billion.
Hi, Amesbury.
Cheshire and Warrington councils, the LEP and other stakeholders are determined yet increasingly frustrated in their quest to secure a devolution deal. Can the Minister update the House on the timetable for this deal?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the honourable gentleman is aware, all of the councils he mentions and the LEP have brought up what they refer to as the Prospectus for Growth, which is looking at how they can deliver real economic benefits for the people who live in Cheshire and Warrington. The government remains open to ground-up, locally supported devolution deals, and I would encourage him, and indeed the council leaders and the LEP, to continue in the discussions they've been having with both me and...
Mr. Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday it was announced that Siemens had won the contract for the new Piccadilly line trains and will now invest £200 million in a new train factory in Goole, creating 700 jobs. So not all investment in the south turns out to be all that terrible. But can we make sure that the department, and the Minister in particular, works with Siemens to ensure that the supply chain benefits the north of England in particular?
Well, Mr. Speaker, It takes a former Northern Powerhouse Minister to remind the current Northern Powerhouse Minister that absolutely those new trains built in his constituency in Goole must be something that benefit the entirety of the north of England, and I will work with him to make sure they do so.
Mr. Barry Shearman. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the truth that this front bench team ought to learn? That front bench team. Should they learn that since the departure of the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, there has been no vision, no leadership, and actually no result for the Northern Powerhouse? Can't he provide some real leadership and let us catch up with some of these soft people in the south of England and London who get all the investment?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very torn, because I feel myself partially agreeing with the honourable gentleman, but I certainly don't agree that there has been no vision and leadership in the Northern Powerhouse. Since I became Minister, we've announced a minded deal north of the town. We've reaffirmed the commitment to the North Wales growth deal. We've announced that we intend to do a growth deal in the Borderlands. And the last budget had £1.8 billion of new money going to the north of England.
Return. Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recently launched the £250 million Midlands Engine Investment Fund and agreed a second devolution deal with the Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street. We have also given £4 million to the Midlands Engine Partnership to support a range of economic activity, including that of our very important ceramics sector.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that response. How best can we encourage new businesses into town centres of the Midlands like Longton and Fenton in my constituency so we can see the revival of our high streets?
Mr. Speaker, the future health of our high streets is extremely important, and that's why I'm pleased to be able to announce today that my department is going to launch a call for evidence over the summer looking at the future of our high street. We intend to establish an expert panel to diagnose the issues currently affecting the high street. And I hope when I visit my honourable friend's constituency, as I will do shortly, that Longton and Fenton will make their voices heard.
Mary Rimmer.
Number 11, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, settlement funding has increased in recognition of pressures, including demand for children's services. But in addition, many local authorities have built up substantial reserves over recent years, and it is absolutely right that they use those where necessary to protect high-quality services for taxpayers.
Harry Rimmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Baby P, Victoria Clambier, Shannon Matthews. I'm sure the House remembers these names. Child safety is a major concern right across our country, with councils starting no less than 500 child protection investigations a day. St Helens Council has almost twice as many looked after children than the national average and has pulled £5 million from reserves to fund the care. This is unsustainable. Does the Minister really realise what's at stake? What will he do to ensure that councils have the money they need to support our vulnerable children instead of washing its hands?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government is assured that all local authorities have increased resources to deal with all the various services they have to provide, including children's services, where I'm pleased to say over £9 billion will be spent this year. And with regards to her specific local authority, she mentions the issue of reserves. She may know that reserves in her local authority last year were actually higher than they were 5 years ago.
Man.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all want to live in a Britain where young people are safe, well cared for and nurtured. But for too many, real life is very different to that. They rely instead on council safeguarding services to give them the protection they need. The very services that are facing a £2 billion funding gap and have already overspent by £600 million. So the question is simple. When can we see real action with real money going directly to children's services?
Well, as I just said, Mr. Speaker, there's £9 billion going to children's services just this year. But as the honourable member knows, we are undertaking a fresh review of the relative needs and resources of all local authorities. And as part of that work, there is ongoing work with the Department of Education to understand in detail the specific drivers for children's services up and down the country. And I look forward to his contributions to that piece of work.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Got there in the end.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll answer this question together with question 15. Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education, Children's Services and Skills is responsible for the inspection of local authority children's services. Spending on the most vulnerable children has increased to over £9 billion last year, and I very much welcome the efforts of colleagues in the Education Department and local councils who continually look for ways to improve their services.
Sandy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the murder in Ipswich of a 17-year-old 2 weeks ago and the critical stabbing of a 16-year-old on Wednesday evening, does he recognise the serious effect that cuts to the support for looked-after children and other vulnerable young people are having on their ability to lead safe, productive and law-abiding lives?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously, I'm sure all the House's thoughts are with the families of the young children that the honourable member mentioned at this obviously difficult time for them. And whilst matters of policing and crime are for the Home Office, I, the government and indeed local councils agree with him about the importance of high-quality children's services. He'll know a new inspection framework was introduced earlier this year, and I'm pleased that Suffolk County Council, his local authority, has been rated in good in their last inspection.
Has the Minister spoken to his counterparts at the Education Department to discuss ways to improve the educational attainment of looked after and vulnerable children? And if not, why not?
Good question.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question, and indeed he'll be pleased to know that I met just last week with the Children's Minister to discuss exactly the topic that he raised, and in particular one of the topics we discussed was the Care Leavers Covenant, which the government is piloting and introducing to improve the educational and employment outcomes for children and young people leaving care.
And Waitley.
It's very hard to call...
Start.
17.
Well done. Minister Rath.
The tenant fees bill will ban unnecessary fees and cap deposits, making rent fairer and easier for tenants.
Helen Waitley.
It's hard to call somewhere home if you might not be living there in 3 months' time. And for children, leaving home also can mean leaving school. Could my right honourable friend advise me what he's doing to increase the security of tenancies for people in rental accommodation?
Well, I certainly recognise my honourable friend's concerns in this area. In fact, we will shortly be consulting on the barriers to longer-term tenancies to inform our work and assess what further ways landlords can be supported to offer more secure tenancies.
And Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The legal framework and guidance governing the relationship between lodgers and landlords has not been updated since 2006. Predating the growth in online lettings platforms and the affordability crisis, which has led many more people both to become landlords and become lodgers. In this relationship, both parties can find themselves vulnerable. The current framework of protection is not fit for purpose. Will the government take action to bring the framework that governs the relationship between landlords and lodgers up to date?
Well, I thank the honourable lady. We keep these matters and the regime under constant review. If she would like to write to me with the specific issues that she takes issue with, we'll of course look at them.
Good, Ava.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the government is serious about tackling rogue landlords, will the Secretary of State today back Labour's plans to give local authorities the power to crack down on rogue landlords through private sector licensing without them having to seek permission from central government?
To the honourable lady, we are introducing the tenant fees bill, which will not just make renting fairer but also save tenants an estimated £240 million in its first year. My concern that I would have with Labour's proposals is, as Shelter have said, that actually it would hurt some of the most vulnerable in our society.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 22,000 properties in Hull with a housing, health and social care rating hazard category of 1. That is the highest hazard rating that there is. And all of these properties are in the private rented sector. The cost of repairing and removing these hazards is £23.5 million. Who does the Minister think should pay for that? Does he think it should be the councils, or does he think it should be the private landlords? And if he thinks it should be the private landlords, when will he start making it easier for councils to introduce private landlord licensing?
Well, I thank the honourable lady. We absolutely think that the onus should be on the landlords. That's why we introduced the civil penalties of up to £30,000 on rogue landlords. That's why in April we're introducing banning orders and a database of rogue landlords and agents, so that we make sure that we protect tenants in the real world from that kind of abuse.
Amy Perkins. Oh dear, where is the fella? Not here. He's what? Anyway, the chap's not here. Never mind. Very good. Topical questions. Luke Hall.
Go on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with Ramadan ending, I want to wish everyone Eid Mubarak. This week we remember the Finsbury Park attack, and last week we marked 1 year since the Grenfell Tower tragedy. The cladding thought to have been used on Grenfell Tower was unlawful under existing building regulations and should not have been used. To ensure that there is no doubt about which materials can be used on external walls of high-rise residential buildings, today I am publishing a consultation on banning the use of combustible materials, and copies of the consultation are being placed in the libraries of both houses. This Friday marks the 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush, and I hope colleagues from across the House will welcome the announcement of a National Windrush Day to celebrate the contribution of the Windrush generation.
It is unusual. Luke Hall.
Gloucestershire Council are planning to build thousands of homes that local families need, but a slow build-out rate from developers is putting the whole of the authority's plans at risk because of a shortage of a 5-year land supply. Can my honourable friend update the House on his strategy to ensure that permissions are built as quickly as possible?
I agree with my honourable friend on the need to ensure that permissions are built out quickly. We will be taking that into firm consideration as part of the update to the National Planning Policy Framework, which will be published before the summer. And I hope he will also be aware of the work of my right honourable friend, the member for Dorset West, and the work that he is doing to see what those barriers are to prevent those build-outs from happening, and that we will reflect on his ultimate recommendations.
Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's the timescales for putting cash on the table for the Ayrshire growth deal?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will be aware that the Prime Minister recently announced a growth deal for Ayrshire, and I'm delighted to be able to tell him that the negotiations led by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, are now underway. What I would say to him is that the Ayrshire growth deal can only proceed as fast as the slowest actors, so I hope he will use his not inconsiderable influence to pressurise the Scottish Government to play their part in the negotiation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend advise me when Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire will get our business rates retention?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend has been a long-standing advocate for rural funding for his county, and I'm pleased to tell him we will be continuing to pilot future reform of the business rates retention system in the forthcoming year, and we'll be publishing details about the new pilots very shortly, and would very much welcome Staffordshire's application to become a pilot.
Dean Jardine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituent, Mrs Shirley Todd, a wheelchair user, carried out a survey of parts of the city and discovered that 72% of the businesses were inaccessible to wheelchair users. She has now launched a national campaign and petition. So will the Minister agree to look at plans to make local authorities responsible for proactively enforcing provision under the Equality Act 2010?
I thank the honourable member for raising this important topic, and she'll know that I in the past have spoken about greater provision of changing places in this House. I can tell her that building regulations set access requirements for new buildings. The Equality Act requires providers to make reasonable adjustments, and if someone feels they've been discriminated against, there are several means of redress, and the Equality Advisory Support Service can provide help and support in that process.
Today, local councils in Northamptonshire launched their official 5-week consultation on how the 8 councils in the county might best be merged into 2 by 2020. Would the Secretary of State join me in encouraging all local residents to take part so their views can be heard loud and clear?
Certainly would encourage residents to take part in that consultation. My honourable friend has rightly highlighted the challenge and the need for the county to come together around these. Obviously, we will look to the consultation and look to proposals as they are ultimately forthcoming to provide that long-term stability and long-term solution.
Snell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, houses of multiple occupancy are an important part of a mixed housing economy. But when whole streets of former family properties become HMOs, it can put great pressure on local services and leave remaining residents feeling isolated. So could I ask the Secretary of State what actions he intends to take to genuinely empower local residents to have a meaningful influence on their communities where traditional planning requirements don't apply?
Well, I hope the honourable gentleman and indeed his constituents have had an opportunity to submit on the revised National Planning Policy Framework. We do want to make sure we give clear guidance, but ultimately it will be up to local authorities to get the balance right for the communities they serve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chelmsford is a very rapidly growing city and many new houses are planned. But the plans for the second railway station and bypass have been put off for too many years. Fortunately, we are through to the final round of bids for Housing Infrastructure Fund. Can you update us on the timing and process for Chelmsford's key bids?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. Local authorities can submit their business cases from September. We expect to make the funding decisions later in the autumn. And, of course, the £4 billion forward funding stream is an essential mechanism to unlock the delivery of 400,000 extra homes, but also make sure we carry communities with us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently went out early one morning with the outreach workers of St Mungo's, who help people newly sleeping rough to get into long-term support. So why is the Secretary of State pressing ahead with changes to funding for homeless hostels and other supporting housing, which charities like St Mungo's have said could threaten their hostels?
Well, I can say to the Honourable Lady that I too have visited St Mungo's and have seen some of the excellent work that they are doing around providing that sort of first night out type of support for people out on the streets, and I will continue to work with them and continue to work with other charities as we look towards our strategy for dealing with rough sleeping and how that will need to reflect on all these important issues.
Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will be aware of my views as he and I have discussed them, that the majority of objections to large planning developments are very often based on the fact that the developments themselves add nothing to the vernacular and do not acknowledge the local vernacular, are very often poorly built, and this is part of the result of a lack of local planning officers who are poorly trained. Is there any way the government can look towards affiliating some of the planning officers to REBA or CABE and empowering them so they can stand against the volume house builders?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the point around design is a very powerful one that my right honourable friend has highlighted, something that we have sought to bring people together on, to have a round table to be able to look at these issues, and therefore what the National Planning Policy Framework can do to advance the agenda my right honourable friend has highlighted.
Laura Smith.
Why is the Secretary of State pressing ahead with changes to funding for homeless hostels and other supported housing, which charities in Crewe and Nant, which like the YMCA have said could threaten their vital services?
I thank the honourable member for her question. As you will know, the government has been in consultation on this very issue. We're absolutely committed to reduce homelessness, and we will be able to provide further information in due course.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank you. Can ministers provide an update on the Housing First pilots?
That's me. Up and down. You've got to be quick. I apologise. On the 9th of May, the Secretary of State announced the allocation of funding for the £28 million Housing First pilots, which will be in Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region and the West Midlands. Plans to measure the impact and value for money of the approach is also well underway, and the first beneficiaries of the pilots will be housed in the autumn.
The government's currently consulting on sites for traveller families. Rather than simply looking at more enforcement, which police chiefs and others say won't work, what positive solutions is the Minister considering, and will he meet the all-party group to discuss some of those positive alternatives?
I thank the honourable lady, and I'd certainly be very happy to receive any submissions from her. I do think it's right that we increase the trend of making authorised sites available, and at the same time making sure, both in terms of local authority powers but also police powers, the enforcement and the rule of law applies right across all members of our communities.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. The draft PPF largely closes the loophole of viability assessments which developers often use to avoid the requirement of affordable housing. Would the Minister consider introducing stronger compulsory purchase powers to let local authorities step in and purchase sites where developers continue to refuse to meet their obligations?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. I know how interested he is in this area. CPO powers certainly have a role to play, although they need to be exercised proportionately. And, of course, through the review that has been conducted by my right honourable friend, the member for Dorset West, we'll be able to look at this issue in the round.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, the discussions around the increase in money for the NHS was well publicised, but it's shocking that there is no extra money for social care. So can I ask the Secretary of State, was he aware that these discussions were taking place, and did he make any representations to increase funding for social care?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, as I've already outlined, the government is committed to providing a long-term sustainable settlement for social care. That work has been ongoing for a while, has continued to ongo. It includes the Secretary of State with the Secretary of State for Health and will report in due course.
Tom Purseglove.
Speaker, Corby in East Northamptonshire is right at the forefront when it comes to building new homes and that agenda, but there are a number of planning applications in the system at the moment that are completely unwanted and on green open space, despite the fact that we more than exceed our housing targets. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that in those instances where local communities are doing all the right things, local developers should respect those wishes?
Well, I congratulate my right honourable friend and my honourable friend. It's only a matter of time. And his local authority. We want to see local authorities exercising their ambition. We want to support them with the homes infrastructure funding that's available. And of course, once local authorities have got their local plans in place, they should have the protections in place to make sure that they're properly delivered and not abused.
Russell McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his letter to me on the 7th of June about New Ferry? Can I ask him, when we meet, as he has invited me to do, will he say that that invitation extends not just to myself and to the Mayor of Liverpool City Region, Steve Rotherham, but also to residents from New Ferry?
Well, as the Honourable Lady will know, we have had an exchange of correspondence, and I do take very seriously the concerns that she has highlighted. I will certainly liaise with her office in taking forward finalising that meeting and making it happen.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The music industry, club goers, musicians and the Musicians' Union all welcome the inclusion of the Agent of Change principle in his department's proposed revision to planning regulation. So when is he going to actually bring in this much welcomed and much needed change?
I thank the honourable gentleman and also for the fabulous work he has done alongside UK Music and other people interested in this particular subject to bring about this change in policy, very important area, and the government will be responding very shortly.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, it's really good to see the Northern Powerhouse Minister on the Treasury bench, because in recent weeks I think there was a view that he'd gone out of service when we were facing the rail chaos around the new timetabling. So perhaps he could tell us exactly what he's been doing to improve connectivity between the east and west of the north.
Well, Mr. Speaker, apart from doing ITV, Granada, the BBC and local papers, including the Manchester Evening News, I don't know where the Honourable Lady's been looking, but what I would say is we continue to work with Transport for the North to improve transport connections across the north of England, but this government has been absolutely clear that the performance of Northern has been unacceptable. But I'd like to offer the benches opposite the opportunity to condemn the strike action by RMT, which is going to make a bad situation worse, or are they too heavily and hot to the unions to do what's right for the Northern Powerhouse?
Mr. Speaker, good public health is the best way of improving the well-being of the community, and yet York City Council has slashed the public health budget by £1.3 million, and we now have the highest level of in-service drug deaths in the country. So what is the Minister doing to protect public health, and particularly with the removal of the public health grant?
Questions, but I hope the House will take it in the right spirit. If I say I don't think many honourable and right honourable members have yet read the textbook on pithy questioning available on general release from the right honourable gentleman member for New Forest West. It would be a very useful Christmas present. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The public health grant is not being ended. It is being folded into the business rates retention plan that the local government sector has welcomed and agreed for that process. There is also a new funding formula being worked out with the Department of Health specifically for public health, and I'm sure we'll welcome the honourable lady's contributions to that.
John Grogan.
Yet personally had the chance to consider the important matter of Yorkshire devolution, and will he agree to meet the Yorkshire leaders from all parties before Yorkshire Day on August the 1st? The Secretary of State personally.
We don't want it.
Well, we've seen peace and harmony across the House from Yorkshire, Mr. Speaker. I've been having discussions with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, about Yorkshire devolution, and with the Mayor of South Yorkshire, who was recently elected. The government has been absolutely clear that before One Yorkshire can proceed, the South Yorkshire devolution deal must be fully implemented. That is up to the Labour Party councils in South Yorkshire to get on with it. There is nearly £1 billion in government funding that could flow to South Yorkshire. Why don't they seem to want it?
Johnson.
While he's on his feet, could he tell me when he expects a spade to be in the ground on the North Wales growth deal? Any project, any spade, anywhere.
Mr Speaker, as the Honourable Gentleman is aware, because he, like me, attended a meeting at the Welsh office just before Christmas, the North Wales growth deal is proceeding well. It can only go as fast as the slowest actors. So I would say to him, he has power and influence over the North Wales local authority. This government has been clear. We would like to see concrete proposals come forward for the budget in the autumn, but we can't do it without the support of the North Wales authorities.
Colleagues, as I always like to welcome new young members, I call for the second time today Mr Barry Sherman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the Secretary of State urgently give local authorities new powers and new resources to tackle the tide of plastic and other waste that is engulfing our towns, cities and our countryside?
Well, I think the Right Honourable Gentleman, with all of his years in this House, will recognise the importance of this very issue and how the Department for the Environment as well has been taking important steps. Of course, there is a responsibility for local government, but equally I hope he will welcome the settlement that has seen more resources going to local government under this government.
Order! Order!